It's an honor for me to hold a presentation here as within the framework of Translating Europe. I already had the chance to hold presentations in Budapest, and now it's a great honor to be here. Also within the framework of our e-transfer project, as you can see at the logo, so I will have some reference to that as well. What I would like to speak about concerns mainly the interaction of terminology and translation from the perspective of the translator trainers. We may have some students as well, and also in the booth, so I hope that it will be useful for everybody. My point is that terminology has become an established subject as a terminology course throughout the years, but terminology may pop up always as a question in translation courses as well. So even translator trainers teaching translation may face a number of problems related to terminology, and these trainers may not necessarily have this terminology background. Terminology teachers may have. So what I try to do is that to summarize what may be the key messages translator trainers may convey when teaching translation about terminology problems. In terminology courses, the perspective is focused rather on the terminologist, but my focus is now the translator. So what are the terminological problems that translators may face during the translation process? And I will touch upon three key areas. So first, the notion of term, then the notion of equivalence, and then the strategies solving these problems. So let's start with the notion of term. I highlight some statements I got during the interviews I carried out almost 10 years ago at the European Commission, the European Parliament, within the framework of my PhD studies. And I asked translators working as terminologists what they think about terminology. And I was truly struck by these statements, as you can see. So if you just scan through them, so I think the most striking one is, may a term have synonyms at all? So when speaking of terms, how do we deal then with synonyms? Or the last one, from a practical point of view, a term may be everything that causes a problem for translators. So what you could see was two extreme point of views. It was also a lesson for me, and then I tried to deal with it in more detail, and this is what I would like to show to you. So the main questions here are, what is the definition in when we speak about terms? How do we deal with synonyms in that case? And how do we deal with polysemy? And the problem is when translators deal with these questions and they have a text, then either they find too many terms or too few terms. And then the problems arise from this problem. And I will also show it to you on the basis of a text. My first key point is, when we come to the notion of term, that we have two different approaches coming from the history of terminology theory. And the narrow approach goes back to Husserl's Terminologielehre, as he also mentions. So the roots lie there in the first years of the last century, where there was a big chaos in communication. There were either too many terms describing the same concept or too many concepts relating to one single term, so especially engineers had to deal with synonymy and polysemy. And Husserl's main idea was to optimize communication and to eliminate synonymy and polysemy for this purpose. And his idea was to start from the concept. It was really revolutionary at that time to start from the concept. Concepts shall be distinguished by a precise definition. They fit into a beautiful conceptual system, and these concepts have then designations, terms that describe them. The main criteria, because of the purpose to optimize communication, was on the one hand, Eindeutigkeit, which is very difficult to translate actually from German into English, but let's say it means unambiguousness, yeah, so there is no polysemy. And Eindeutigkeit, which is even more difficult to translate from German into English, which means one-to-one correspondence. So in the end, one term describes only one concept, and one concept relates only to one term. So this would be the ideal word for a translator. Yeah? So no synonyms, no polysemy, and terms and concepts. Between terms and concepts, only one-to-one correspondence. You could hold a separate lecture about this slide. It was just a very quick summary. But my main point is that here in this narrow approach, the term is the final product of a prescriptive process. So when you start from this perspective, then the term is what meets this criteria, Eindeutigkeit or Eindeutigkeit. So it says basically how terms should be. The problem is that translators, when they take a text, they do not meet only terms that meet these criteria. Yeah? These criteria may fit into a terminology database because you need this kind of terms in a terminology database in most of the cases. But translators, when they deal with a text, they are not interested in the history of the terms, and they have, in most of the cases, no idea whether these terms have gone through a prescriptive process or not. They see the text, and they have to recognize what is a term and what is not. So what I described here resulted in the broad approach of the notion of term, and luckily for us, translator training institutions played a huge role of that, because in the 70s and in the 80s, translator training institutions realized that this traditional theory of terminology may not be relied on in translator training institutions, because translators faced synonymy and polysemy in a text, and they still thought, but these are terms, even if they are synonymous or they are polysem. And they faced a number of terms that lacked a clear definition, but they still thought that they should be considered as terms. So this criticism led also to a number of research works, and they concluded the same statement. So they said, if there is a definition, if there is no definition, because it's not always possible, we still may speak about terms. Synonymy is part of professional communication, so you have to take into account this aspect into the theory as well. And polysemy is necessary. Think of the different legal systems, for example, that are described by the same language. For example, German in Austria and German in Germany. Yeah? So you may have, if you think for the German colleagues now, Abfindung, it describes a different concept in the Austrian legal system and in the German legal system. So this approach, this broad approach, is described very precisely by Long, who says that the notion of term is relative and it depends on the purpose. If you set up a prescriptive terminology database, then you may follow a very narrow approach of the notion of term, and then you have strict criteria. But if you take a text in translation, then you have a translation purpose, and then your perspective is much broader than in the narrow approach. So what is this broader approach? So let me turn now to the purpose of translation. I can imagine that you as translator trainers or even students, you are often struck by the question, what is a term? Yeah? So students take a text, and then you ask them to underline the terms in the text, and then the first question pops up, but what is a term? What is the definition of the term? And I would reformulate it, and I would ask, why is it relevant for me as a translator what a term is? Because if you go to literature and you look up the definitions of the terms, in some cases they are not helpful at all for translators. Yeah? You see what a term is and then you take the text, but does it help you? Not necessarily. So the main question here is not what a term is, but why is it relevant to know in a text what a term is and what is not. And let me show it to you on an example, which we also use now in the terminology summer school and also with some of my colleagues in Budapest. This is a press release issued by the European Commission. And if you ask students to underline terms in these texts, then probably they wouldn't have problems at all in the beginning to underline European Parliament, the Council and all the institutions. They are happy that underline them, they are for sure terms. But then my experience is that they start underlining also words like agreement or trialogue, or even they say, yeah, provisional agreement. So maybe this is also something which is like, yeah, there is maybe a concept behind, or decisive trialogue. It also sounds, you know, very serious and so on. So now I play a little bit at the extreme, but I think you understand what I mean. Yeah. So sometimes they cannot really decide, and then conciliation procedure. Of course, the helps them, yeah, that, okay, here I have to be careful because it's the conciliation procedure, so it might have some fixed concept behind, so it may be a term. And then commitments and payment credit, because they are in one single sentence related to money, then they may start thinking that these are terms related to economics, so these may also be terms as well. And then there is one last one, which may cause problems, at least in my experience, it always causes problems, and this is irregular migration in an EU context. You could translate it in many ways, in Hungarian as well, but the problem is that in the EU context, this is a fixed term, and there was also a discussion process in all the languages with it. So this, in another context, not an EU context, this may be translated in many ways into the languages, but if it's an EU text now in the EU context, then it has fixed, bound equivalents in all the target languages of the European Union. And now the text goes on, and you also have a table here, the EU budget with the headings, and here an unexperienced translator may just translate right away, yeah? And translate smart and inclusive growth, security and citizenship, global Europe, and even administration, yeah? Because administration is just like a word, yeah, which refers to the administrative affairs. The problem is that since it is part of the EU budget, all the single headings here may be considered as terms because they also have bound equivalents in all the 24 target languages. So in any other context, administration is just a general word, but in this context, administration is a fixed heading and it is a term, and heading as well. So coming back to my first question, why is it relevant to know what a term is? The answer is the translator's freedom. Because if you see terms in a text, then your freedom as a translator is restricted. And that's the main point. So from the translator's point of view, not the definitions, the different definitions of the term are important, but the fact that when you face a term, then you have to be alert because your freedom as a translator is restricted. And this is a beautiful example here. Administration may be translated in a number of ways into other languages, but in that specific case, you have to look up how in the EU context it was translated. So if I try to summarize all these groups of terms from the translator's point of view in the text and the difficulty level of recognition, then I would start with generally, terms, and I know now it's a bit misleading that I call them terms because we are speaking of terms generally, but I would say that payment credits and commitments, these are terms a beginner translator would also recognize as terms. Yeah, they would also think, yeah, I have to be alert, there may be a fixed equivalent, these are terms. But what is more difficult and not so easy to recognize are words that act as terms in different contexts. And these were my examples with heading, administration, irregular migration. So these are basically words in another context, but when they get into a context where they start acting as terms, then from the translator's point of view, your freedom again is limited. And my last example, and that's the most difficult one, when words act as terms in a specific text. And I have for that a classic example, and sorry if there are also some colleagues, because that's always my best example, and some may have heard it. I had a home translation project with my students several years ago, and I asked them to translate like a 20-page long text, a Harvard case study. So it was a heavy economic text, and they really wanted to do something great for me. Yeah, so they really worked together for weeks. They wanted to produce a beautiful text in the end. I got the text in Hungarian. I started reading it, and on purpose, I didn't read the original text. I just, went right away and started reading the Hungarian one. And what I felt after 2 pages was that I didn't understand the text at all. The sentences were beautiful, there were no spelling mistakes, generally no mistakes. But after 2 pages, I asked myself, what is this text about? How many groups there are in the company? Because in the original text, the company spoke about 2 job profiles in the company, generalists and specialists. But my students started translating these 2 job profiles in a number of different ways into Hungarian, okay? So for specialists, they found 3-4 Hungarian words. For generalists, they found 3-4 words, and then they started using them in the text. When I found this out, then we had like a 1-hour discussion in class, and they told me, but look, I started using synonyms because we were trained throughout our studies, in primary school, in secondary school, that the more synonyms you use, the more beautiful your text looks like. And it was for me like a big heureka, lesson or revelation, and I thought, yeah, that's the key point, yeah? If it comes to terminology in a text, you mustn't use synonyms, yeah? Because the text cohesion was simply destroyed in this text, yeah? So even if you had no mistakes, the sentences were beautiful, but you could just throw out of the window the whole paper because you couldn't understand the whole text. And let me come back to this. So these are words like generalist and specialist that started acting as terms in this specific text. They would never come probably into a terminology database, yeah? So it was not about how to translate generalist and specialist, yeah? So from a translator's point of view, it's not a big deal, yeah, to translate these 2 words. The big deal was to think as a terminologist in this respect and not using synonyms. So how can you help students, yeah, to avoid these problems? First of all, I think it's very useful to give the theoretical background I just gave you. So there are 2 approaches, the narrow approach and the broad approach, and the translator needs a broad approach. When you take a text, then you can do a simple exercise like that. At least this is what I do a number of times. First, I ask them to underline terms in the text that would fit, in their opinion, into a terminology database. Yeah? So I ask them, please, now act as a terminologist, underline those terms that would fit into a terminology database. Then I ask them to revise it and include also terms where your freedom as a translator is limited. So terms that would not come into a terminology database, but where your freedom is limited. In this case, they also underline generalist, specialist, administration, and so on, and all these words. So you start from too few terms, from the narrow approach, and you broaden their horizon. In the second case, you start from too many terms, and then I ask them, underline terms you think are terms, yeah? So the general way, you know, of acting as a translator and dealing with a text. And then I ask them to revise it and exclude words where you are free to use a target language equivalent. And in that case, of course, you should exclude agreement and trialogue in the text, because you soon realize that it doesn't matter what word you use. And I think these exercises also help them, you know, with this question, when can I use only one single target language equivalent, and when am I free to use more? Because at least in my experience, their problem is always, you know, is it good, this solution, or is the other one also okay? Yeah? And from a terminology point of view, you know, sometimes it just, they ask these questions and this is not the point. Yeah? This is the little problem and not the big problem. Okay, and then when you do this exercise, then you come in the text to terms in a translation-oriented perspective. Okay, and then, last but not least, let me come to equivalence and the strategy, yeah? Because this is another huge bunch of problems translators face. So if we start from the notion of terms, so terms describing concepts and concepts described by terms, then usually we face problems that result from the different conceptual systems. Yeah? That the languages describe reality in different ways. So think of the different economic systems, think of the different company times, different legal systems, school systems, and so on. And here you may have full equivalence between the two concepts, partial equivalence, very simplified, or lack of equivalence. Yeah, I have just some examples. Yeah, we will go on. But the key point here is that the difficulties in translation may not only come from the conceptual level, from the differences between two conceptual systems, but also at term level, because the two languages are also different. And here are my examples. So for example, these are EU examples, the first two. It was very difficult to translate Plan D, democracy, dialogue, and debate into Hungarian, because democracy, dialogue, that was okay in Hungarian. You could find two words starting with D, but debate was quite difficult, it was quite a challenge, because we didn't have any Hungarian word starting with D that would express the same meaning as debate. So what you see here is at concept level, translators didn't have any problems because the concept was defined. They knew exactly what the definition was, but they had problems at language level, at term level, and of course they opted in the end for three words with different initials, but they kept the D abbreviation. The Finnish colleagues were lucky because they found three words starting with K. Yeah, so that was okay, starting with D, and it became Plan K. And flexicurity is also a beautiful example because, of course, it's easy to create the equivalent in languages which are similar to English, but in Hungarian you couldn't combine the two words that would express the same meaning, and then now you have a Hungarian equivalent with two words, and flexicurity was also accepted as an admitted term in the Hungarian EU terminology. Another example is when the part of speech is not okay. So you have in biology, for example, heavy soil, But in Hungarian, you cannot express it in the same way with an adjective and a noun. You have just one single noun in Hungarian. So as you see, we could have, of course, hundreds and hundreds of further examples, but what you see here that the problems are at term level, and this is the level what experts sometimes don't understand. Experts rather move at the conceptual level. They have the background knowledge, they know the conceptual system. You can ask them as a translator, is it right if this concept, I found the definition of that, and is it okay, are they equivalent or not? But if a translator goes to an expert and says, look, I have problems because this equivalent just doesn't work in the title of my text, then the expert sometimes says, what, it doesn't work in the title? That's the equivalent, just use it. Because, you know, it's another kind of a problem. That's a linguistic problem and not an expert problem. And vice versa, you know, linguists may not have the conceptual background, the knowledge to move on the conceptual level. For example, what's the difference between two company types? Yeah, there the problem is not at term level, but at conceptual level. So what can you do with that? What kind of strategies you may follow? I chose now a very simple example. I think it's everyone, which is everyone familiar with, solicitor. You all know that the legal profession has two coins, two sides in the common law system, solicitor and barrister. And if I want to translate it into German, the one option is that I just say right away Rechtsanwalt. Yeah? If it's about a novel, yeah, then I can just say Rechtsanwalt because nobody really cares, yeah, that the solicitor may not act before the court. And, you know, if it's about a novel, then you can just leave it like that. But if it's about a contract, or if this is a professional text about how to become a solicitor or a barrister in the UK, then you may have different solutions. And the one is Rechtsanwalt, for example, but then you put into brackets nicht bei Gericht. Or you say solicitor, you keep the original one, and then you say Rechtsanwalt, des durch das Common Law geprägten System, and you can go on, so give basically a definition in the brackets. Or in the end, you just leave it and you don't say it, anything else. The first case is called domesticating, that's the domesticating strategy, the functional equivalent. And the second case is the foreignizing strategy, which is called translation equivalent. And the tools you can do that are either by call, loan, paraphrasing, neologism, or the combination of all this. In my experience, this is a weak point in training sometimes, to differentiate between these two options, option A and option B, domesticating or foreignizing. And it may be quite dangerous because in translation studies, domesticating strategy has been considered as the main strategy for years, yeah, because of the Skopos principle and so on. I can mention as an example, you know, in Hungarian, even the authors of novels were translated into Hungarian. So there are many Hungarian students who still think, for example, that Jules Verne is a Hungarian author because it's Verne Gyula in Hungarian. You know, so that's like the extreme domestication where you even translate the author. And legal translations first realized that it's a dangerous path to go. So there are some cases where you have to follow a foreignizing strategy, even if in that case it may be very strange, very weird to your target language audience. The problem again here is, we may all know this, yeah? So I suppose that what I described here, so some of you may think, of course, foreignizing, domesticating, I've already had that in my studies. But the problem is that this is not known at all to the commissioners of translations, yeah? So if I get a translation, for example, a contract or a legal text, then my first question would be, what do you expect from me? Shall I follow a domesticating strategy, or a foreignizing strategy. So what do you want me to do? Shall I bring it closer to your system, to the target language system, or shall I just describe the original system in the target language? And this is like the first question that has to pop up in the beginning. But if you ask this, they don't understand. They don't understand at all, and they rather expect you to domesticate. So if a translator writes solicitor in the text, then the commissioner may ask, but you are a translator, why don't you translate for me what is solicitor, yeah? And then you have to start explaining. So here, just, to close this section here, that's why theory is important, because if you can name these phenomena by their names, if you can explain what is domesticating, what is foreignizing, what is a functional equivalent, what is a translation equivalent, then you can also defend your choices as a translator much better. Then it's not anymore, between, choosing several terms, but it's choosing between strategies, and that's the key point. Just one more example. Here from Untitled Chapter, which is also very like a classic example, but I think it's a very good description of the problem. So what you see here is the German system of courts, and Untitled Chapter made an inquiry how the translation of these courts into French appears in the dictionaries. And they found that there are two kinds, of solutions. The one is functional equivalence, so domesticating strategy, which describes the existing system of French courts. There is only partial equivalence between, Amtsgericht and Tribunal d'instance or Landgericht Tribunal de Grande Instance, so it's not the same at all. But that specific dictionary opted for a domesticating strategy, and they said, we don't care that they are not full equivalents, but we just say they are. And other dictionaries opted for a foreignizing strategy, and here, these are non-existing French courts. So what you do here is you just describe this system in French. So the difference is really huge. It's really a conceptual question what you do. And I also tried to summarize it in a graph. So if you have a source language term describing a source language concept, then you either opt for a functional equivalent, which describes a target language concept, even if they are not equivalents. Yeah? So that's domesticating. Okay? So there, behind the target language term, you also have a target language concept. But if you follow a foreignizing strategy, what you do is you just describe the original concept in your language. You have different tools for that, calc, loan, paraphrasing, neologism, but you remain in this system, in the original system, while in the other one, by using a domesticating strategy, you jump into the other system, yeah? Then you speak about the other system, and the two are extremely different. Okay? And to conclude my last slide, so I highlight the key messages that may be important in translator training. So the first one, the notion of term is relative, and for translation purposes, the translator freedom is a key point when explaining translators what a term is and what is not. The term, in a broad translation-oriented approach, may be any lexical unit in a text, at text level. And here, synonyms are careful. So if in the text you have terms, you have to be careful with synonyms. The third one, equivalence. Difficulties arise both at concept level and at term level. So if we speak about equivalence, it's not only at the concept or at the term level. And so the translator acts both as an expert and as a linguist, expert at concept level, linguist at term level, and being a terminologist creates the link between the two, and that's why we can speak about a separate terminology competence, which we also included in the ease transfer competence model. And as for the strategies, step one, when there are two different conceptual systems, is always to decide whether to follow a foreignizing or domesticating strategy, and step two is, when you already opted for foreignizing strategy, then you have to decide whether to use a calque, a loan, a paraphrasing, or a neologism. And summarizing this is what we can call translation-oriented terminology work. So it's not about databases, what to include into a database, it's about how to deal with terms in a specific text. Thank you very much.